Hello everyone, and welcome to Watchman Review. This video, The Evil Plan, is the first in a series of 7 on the study of current events as related to prophecy. Let me ask you a question. Have you recently wondered what's going wrong in the world today? That something isn't quite right? There is an evil plan in motion now. Prophecy is also in motion now. Many believe, as I, that both may affect each of us as early as this year, 2017. Let me show you what I'm talking about. As a military veteran, you tend to know things. We were privy to those things. They lead to questions, which leads to research, and finally awareness, assuming one even wants to know truth. The more time spent researching, the more things made sense, and yet there still remained many significant questions. Did the U.S. government really construct FEMA camps and underground tunnels? If so, why? Do they wish to reprogram us, or are they going underground for their own safety? Are aliens real? If so, what is their part? Should I be concerned about Muslim immigrants? What's up with CERN? Pick your conspiracy. Through it all, the real question became, what could they be preparing for? It's either to take control or to save their own butts from something disastrous. I think it's both. Since I could not determine why those with the money and power would do as they are, it dawned on me to take a different approach to the many conspiracies. What does Bible prophecy say? Does it relate to what's happening today? I am obligated to share my findings. You are about to know more than 90% of sheeple in the world today. But first, you need to know about the evil plan. If there is an evil plan, then what does that plan look like? Who would go through with such a thing, and what do they want? Men have practiced evil since creation, but let's start this story around the year 600 BC when the Hebrews were captured by King Nebuchadnezzar II and taken as slaves into Babylon. While there, many of the Hebrews took up the practice of worshiping the Babylonian gods, Baal or Baal, and others. In time, the mystic side religion of Kabbalah formed and evolved. Many believe Kabbalah is just another form of Satan worship, invoking powers from pre-flood fallen angels. Kabbalah continues within recesses of Judaism today, such as by Zionist Jews and now by many non-Jews around the world. Zionism itself was formed by Rothschild and other elites, who intentionally re-established Israel in 1947. They exist not for Jews, but for themselves. So let's go ahead and skip forward in time to the 1760s when Mayor Amschel Rothschild, then a court Jew to the German Landgraves of Hesse-Kassel, began his eventual banking empire. Rothschild spread his 5 sons across Europe into England, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria, opening banks to fund governments and wars. Before long, they owned most of Europe. Let's take a closer look.
Let's go back into history and start at the beginning. The original architect of the Rothschild family fortune was a Jew named Meyer Amschel Rothschild. He was born in 1744 in a dirt-poor Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt, Germany. He and his family lived above the family shop with about 30 other relatives. It was extremely cramped conditions. His father's name was Amschel Moses, and Amschel Moses worked as a money changer and a silk cloth trader. Meyer's father had a man named Prince William of Hesse on his client list. So even though the family was very poor, they did have some political connections from the very beginning. A few years pass, and by the time that Meyer is 12 years old, both of his parents have died. Up until this point, he had been studying the Talmud in a rabbinical school in Fürth. But after his parents died, he decided this isn't for me, and he goes to Hanover to study finance. And Prince William also put Meyer in charge of supervising the operation of his properties, and also put him in charge of doing his tax gathering. Another thing that helped to boost Meyer's wealth very quickly was his marriage in 1770 to a woman named Gutla Schnapper. Her father was also a court agent, like Meyer was. Very wealthy, though. He gave Meyer a really generous dowry to start out their family. So together, Meyer and Gutla end up having 5 sons and 5 daughters together. As an extension of Meyer's work, selling antiques, he broke with Jewish religious law and he began selling to his customers based on credit. And this caused his personal wealth to explode. It went in just 1 year from 4,000 gulden in 1795 to over 60,000 gulden just the very next year. The law of Moses is very anti-credit. In the Bible, it's called usury. The practice of lending credit was known to be a way to bring people into financial bondage, so it was prohibited. It's also why we have today in America and in many places around the world, after 7 years of bankruptcy, your debt is wiped out. That was part of the law of Moses. When the French Revolution broke out, Meyer found that the business of war was very, very profitable. And the seeds of the modern Zionist finance military industrial complex were sown by Meyer Rothschild. He made a fortune by selling supplies to the army in Austria. And with this increased wealth, he used the money to start importing large volumes of English textiles, and he expanded his operations into more and more nations around the world during the early days of the Industrial Revolution. He's making a fortune, and he's expanding his business. We get to the point where Rothschild's 5 sons are finally old enough to join in their father's business. So around the turn of the century, around 1800, Meyer sent his 5 sons to establish banks in 5 different places: Frankfurt, Germany, Naples, Italy, Vienna, Austria, Paris, France, and in London, England. These 5 sons are represented in the Rothschild family coat of arms. When you look at it, Meyer is represented as a fist that is clutching 5 arrows. Symbolically, the release of the 5 arrows into the capitals of the major European nations to establish these centers of power, that marks the beginning of the Rothschilds' global banking dynasty. And Nathan went on to pioneer, this is what Nathan's known for, he went on to pioneer the ingenious but diabolical strategy of lending great amounts of money to governments during wartime, where you fund both sides of the conflict. And as part of the deal with him issuing the money, he would ensure that the winner of the conflict was obligated to cover the loser's debt so that he would never lose any money, no matter who won and who lost. He used this strategy as well in the famous Waterloo story. The important Battle of Waterloo took place in 1815, and it pitted the French forces of Napoleon against the Anglo-Allied forces of Great Britain, right? So Nathan had concocted a scheme to trick British investors and profit from the outcome of the battle. He had a courier, a spy basically, that was on site at the battle watching to see who won, who came back to deliver word there in London about who won. It's not like today where you've got cell phones and the internet and can find things out instantaneously. You had to actually travel great distances to get news back then. Well, Nathan had arranged to get the news before anyone else. So when he found out that the British had defeated Napoleon, he pretended like he had just gotten news that Napoleon had actually won. And so he goes into the exchange with a stone face, and he publicly sells his vast British bond holdings, causing the other investors to think that, oh geez, this rich guy, he's an insider, he has just learned that the British lost the battle, and therefore the British bond market's going to crash. See, what had happened is the Bank of England had financed the British war using these war bonds, and the people who bought the war bonds, they did so expecting that they would get a return on investment, a profit from having loaned the money, but only if Great Britain won. So the response to Nathan Rothschild's feint was a mass sell-off of British bonds by the other investors. But when the bond prices hit rock bottom, Rothschild, who had been biding his time, he turned around and reinvested all of his money back into the market, buying up everything he could, not just what he had sold, but what everyone else had sold. And he got it for pennies on the dollar because the bonds were worthless at that point. Then when word reached the general public that Britain had actually defeated Napoleon, the bonds surged back to their previous levels, giving the Rothschild dynasty immense wealth, immense profit. It was diabolical, it was evil, but, it worked. What's important to remember is that the King of England had issued the bonds as a debt obligation, meaning that it would be the British citizens, as taxpayers, who were responsible for paying the profits to the Rothschild. Very similar to how the Federal Reserve managed to manipulate the U.S. government into making American taxpayers responsible for about $16 trillion worth of bailouts to keep their Wall Street banking buddies propped up after the 2008 economic crisis. The Rothschilds had become the masters of making money off the business of war, and with their unparalleled fortunes and influence, they set forth to keep nations in a perpetual state of chronic warfare. That's something that we do to this day, these war masters. They want to keep us in constant, never-ending, ceaseless warfare, because that's how they make their money, through the war industry. It's also how they conquer nations and set up new central banks. You have to overthrow one government if they resist in order to get your people in and establish a new bank. You just look at the example of Gaddafi. That's what that was about. The bankers wanted to go in. Gaddafi was resisting. He was trying to establish his own gold-backed dinar to unite the African continent on their own monetary system that would have opposed the Rothschild-type system. So, of course, they've got to go. That's why they used Hillary Clinton in the State Department and the CIA to go in and overthrow Gaddafi. And the very first action that they took after they overthrew Gaddafi was they put in a Rothschild central bank. Anyway, in 1818, the Rothschild family wealth was around 500,000 pounds. That doesn't sound like much today, but back then it was a huge fortune. But by profiting off of wars within only 10 years, their fortune went from that £500,000 to over £4 million. It was a huge increase. So for most of the 1800s, the network of Rothschild banks dominated the international market. If you wanted to try and picture a modern equivalent, just think how powerful a bank would be if we merged J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, the Bank of England, and added in the entire International Monetary Fund to the mix. The Rothschilds were truly the most powerful banking cartel the world has ever known. Even governments would crawl to the Rothschilds asking them to finance their nations. There was simply no limit to the power of these Jewish bankers. Consider these facts. The Rothschild dynasty owns the Bank of England and the London Gold Bullion Exchange, where the Rothschilds set the daily international market for the price of gold. They control it. The House of Rothschild owns the gold and the diamond mines of South Africa. They own major extractive industries such as British petroleum corporations like BP. Remember, these oil companies like BP have controlled the oil fields of entire nations. Political propaganda confuses American citizens into thinking that the U.S. government owns and prints its own money, and that's just not true. All the money we use in America comes from a small handful of banking families who partnered with the Rothschilds to create the Federal Reserve. That's the truth of it. The Rothschild dynasty also owns Reuters News Service, which bought the Associated Press. They own or virtually control every major outlet in America and Europe and Israel. It's no coincidence that the general public doesn't know anything about the Rothschild dynasty and how powerful the family truly is, because they use the media to keep attention away from them. The combined wealth of the House of Rothschild is said to be upwards of $100 trillion. The fortune is still dramatically higher than the next wealthiest family, which is the Rockefeller dynasty. Their wealth stands at, they say it's around $11 trillion. So we have to ask ourselves, if the Rothschilds are so rich, then why don't they appear on the Forbes richest list? The answer to that question is partly due to the thing that Meyer Rothschild feared the most and tried to prevent, which is the dispersion of Rothschild assets into the hands of too many descendants.
In 1773, Amschel Rothschild meets and joins with two other bizarre fellows named Jacob Frank, a Jewish cultist, and Adam Weishaupt, a Catholic Jesuit priest and founder of the Illuminati. Some say the Rothschilds themselves are Jesuits, even managing Vatican money. Together, these three men accelerated an idea of world domination.
This satanic plot was launched back in the 1760s when it first came into existence under the name of the Illuminati. This Illuminati was organized by one Adam Weishaupt, born a Jew, who was converted to Catholicism and became a Catholic priest, and then, at the behest of the then newly organized House of Rothschild, defected and organized the Illuminati. Naturally, the Rothschilds financed that operation. And every war since then, beginning with the French Revolution, has been promoted by the Illuminati, operating under various names and guises. I say under various names and guises because after the Illuminati was exposed and became too notorious, Weishaupt and his co-conspirators began to operate under various other names. In the United States, immediately after World War I, they set up what they called the Council on Foreign Relations, commonly referred to as the CFR. And this CFR is actually the Illuminati in the United States. And its hierarchy, the masterminds in control of the CFR, to a very great extent, are the descendants of the original Illuminati conspirators. But to conceal that fact, most of them changed their original family names to American-sounding names. For example, the true name of the Dillons, Clarence and Douglas Dillon, once Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department, is Lepowski. I'll come back to all this later. There is a similar establishment of the Illuminati in England, operating under the name of the British Institute of International Affairs. There are similar secret Illuminati organizations in France, Germany, and other nations operating under different names. And all these organizations, including the CFR, continuously set up numerous subsidiary or front organizations that are infiltrated into every phase of the various nations' affairs. But at all times, the operations of these organizations were and are masterminded and controlled by the internationalist bankers, who in turn were and are controlled by the Rothschilds. One branch of the Rothschild family had financed Napoleon. Another branch of the Rothschilds, both branches the real masterminds of the Illuminati, financed Britain, Germany, and the other nations in the Napoleonic Wars. Immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, the Illuminati assumed that all the nations were so destitute and so weary of wars that they'd be glad for any solution. So the Rothschild stooges set up what they called the Congress in Vienna, and at that meeting they tried to create the first League of Nations, their first attempted one world government, on the theory that all the crowned heads of the European governments were so deeply in debt to them that they would willingly or unwillingly serve as their stooges.
Later in the 1840s, a man named Albert Pike joins the Scottish Rite Freemasons and quickly became a very important figure within this secret society. Please pay particular attention to this part as it's very important. He predicted 3 world wars and the establishment of a one world government.
In a letter dated 22 January 1870, Mazzini wrote to Pike. Now Albert Pike is this high mason who wrote the manual, if you like, of Scottish Freemasonry. He said the following: "We must allow all of the federations to continue just as they are. It must appear as things are as they were in the beginning, with their systems, their central authorities, and diverse modes of correspondence between high grades of the same rite, organized as they are at present, but we must create a super rite, which will remain unknown, to which we will call those Masons of high degree whom we shall select. With regard to our brothers in Masonry, these men must be pledged to the strictest secrecy. Through this supreme right, we will govern all Freemasonry, which will become the one international center, the more powerful because its direction will be unknown. Now, Albert Pike wrote a letter to Mancini, and that was dated August 15, 1871, in which he propagated that there should be a world order, a one order where all nations are under the control of one central organization. And in order to achieve this, they planned, and there are numerous quotes for this, so I've put a number on the screen because some will say, I don't trust this, I don't trust that, I don't trust the other. Here are references down there, there are references up there, there will be references in other slides, so it comes from different sources. He said, and this was, by the way, on display in the British Museum and could be seen there until it was taken away. The First World War, to overthrow the power of the Tsars in Russia, protector of orthodoxy, and bring about an atheistic communistic state. Did that happen? Yes. Now that was written long before this event. Long before this event. This was written in 1871, but this war broke out in 1914. The Second World War, that's also written long before the event, to originate between Great Britain and Germany, to strengthen communism as antithesis to the Judeo-Christian culture, and bring about a Zionist state in Israel. Did it achieve this objective? Yes. In fact, after this war, Israel, in its present form, was reinstated under the protection of Britain. And then, interestingly enough, a Third World War, a Middle Eastern war involving Judaism and Islam and spreading internationally. That's fascinating. Is that on the cards, or what do you think?
Here, the police officers, FBI agents,
Certainly sounds like we are on track. Well, here's another quote, just in case people don't like that quote. Mazzini with Pike developed a plan for 3 world wars so that eventually every nation would be willing to surrender its national sovereignty to a world government. The first war was to end the Tsarist regime in Russia, the second to allow the Soviet Union to control Europe, the Third World War was to be in the Middle East between Muslim and Jews and would result in Armageddon. Interesting. Now, how were they going to do it? Let's read what Albert Pike wrote about these wars and how they were going to be unleashed. He wrote, quote, "We shall unleash the nihilist and the atheist," so the destroyer and the atheist, "and we will provoke a formidable social cataclysm which in its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism. Origin of savagery and the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the minority of revolutionaries will exterminate these destroyers of civilization, and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, will receive the pure light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer. The destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time." Wow, what a clever plan. So you rub the two systems which you create up against the other. You create atheism as an antithesis to the Judeo-Christian culture. You have these two clash until they rub each other up, and then out of that you will get a new world order where you have a new religion which is far more esoteric and actually honors Satan. Isn't that a rather clever plan?
Then, in 1913, the Rothschilds and other elite bankers coordinated the intentional fall of U.S. banks, and then rushed in to save the day with their privately owned Federal Reserve. There's nothing federal about the Federal Reserve. You can thank President Woodrow Wilson for discreetly signing that one into law while Congress was on holiday.
In November of 1910, a secret meeting took place of 6 bankers and economic policymakers who represented the financial elite of the Western world. It was hosted at the J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island in Georgia. In attendance was Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, Abram Pyatt Andrew Jr., Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davidson, Senior Partner of J.P. Morgan and Company, Charles D. Norton, President of First National Bank of New York, Paul Warburg, Director of Wells Fargo, Benjamin Strong, the emissary for J.P. Morgan and, coincidentally, the first president of the Federal Reserve. This private meeting, attended by some of the most powerful men in America, was strategically designed to take control of our country's money supply and to achieve ultimate power in America. Meyer Amschad Rothschild, one of the most powerful European bankers of his time, stated it best when he said, "Permit me to issue and control the money of the nation, and I care not who makes its laws." On December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, when most people in Congress were home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. That single act, however small it may seem, transferred the control of our monetary system from our government into the hands of some of the wealthiest men in our country. Putting into law the Federal Reserve Act gave unlimited power to a few wealthy banking institutions in America. The Fed has the power to issue currency, manipulate interest rates, and run secret bailouts. Yet Congress and the President are not allowed full oversight over this powerful organization. The Federal Reserve enjoys a monopoly over the creation of our nation's money and credit, but for 100 years, they have never been completely transparent and accountable about it. And we don't have to look back too far from today to see what it looks like in real life. When testifying before Congress in 2009, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke refused to disclose which institutions received trillions of dollars in these bailouts and loans, or give our representatives details about what deals were being made.
So my question to you is, will you tell the American people to whom you lent $2.2 trillion of their dollars? Will you tell us who got that money and what the terms are of those agreements?
Hundreds and hundreds of banks, any bank or that has access to the U.S. Federal Reserve's discount.
Will you tell us who they are?
No.
In an interview with Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, he makes the stunning assertion that conducting a full audit of the Federal Reserve, something never before done in its 100-year history, is a line that we don't want to cross. To be denied full transparency of these transactions after U.S. taxpayers contributed over $16 trillion to these bailouts and loans is unthinkable and unconstitutional. The elite banking institutions took trillions of dollars worth of risk, and when they lost their bets, they threatened politicians to use taxpayer money to bail them out, or else we would face an Armageddon type of scenario. This historic change of power in America is again why many economists refer to it as the biggest robbery ever enacted on the American people.
Have you ever heard of the Masonic Georgia Guidestones? It's where the elite clearly state their desire to reduce the population to 500 million. That means that well over 90% of us would be weeded out. They state that this is imperative because we should, and I quote, "be not a cancer on the earth, leave room for nature, leave room for nature." Of course, we are to be stewards of the earth, but that does not mean to go out and kill 9 out of 10 people. So now that they have all the money, a plan, resources, and powerful people in place, what next? Since President Trump does not bow to them, should we be concerned? After all, he stands for nationalism and not globalism. And so there it is, the ugly truth. There actually is an evil plan. But what can one do to prepare? Should we store food? Should we invest in silver? Or perhaps there's something more important. Thank you for watching this first video in our series titled The Evil Plan. You can also find these and other related videos in full on our website at www.watchmanreview.com. Stay tuned for the second video in this series titled The Abrahamic God. Thank you for watching and many blessings to you and yours.